In the autumn of the year 9, a Roman army marched into a forest east of the Rhine and never came out. 3 legions, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men. Within 4 days, they had ceased to exist, not retreated, not beaten in the field and withdrawn to regroup, destroyed down to the last cohorts in a running fight through the trees. Estimates of the dead commonly run from 16 to 20,000. Rome reused its legion numbers for centuries. After that autumn, it never used those 3 again. They were quietly retired, and the northern frontier of the empire stopped at that river, permanently. And the man who destroyed them was a Roman citizen of Roman equestrian rank, who had commanded Roman auxiliary cavalry and who had spent months eating at the table of the general he destroyed. That general was Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania. He was around 55 years old. He had been consul. He had married into the family of Augustus himself. He had governed Africa, and he had governed Syria, one of the richest and most difficult commands in the empire. And he had done it competently. He was not a fool. That is the part people get wrong. And he was warned, not vaguely, in specific terms, naming the right man and naming the right plan, by someone who begged to be put in chains himself to prove he meant it. Varus heard the warning, and he had a perfectly reasonable reason to throw it away. By the year 9, Rome had been operating east of the Rhine for roughly 2 decades. Drusus had campaigned there. Tiberius had campaigned there. Armies had marched to the Elbe. Tribes had submitted, given hostages, accepted treaties. On the maps in Rome, Germania was not a war zone. It was a province, new, rough, unfinished, but a province. So Varus governed it like one. This was not arrogance in the way we usually mean it. It was something more dangerous. It was administrative confidence. Varus was not a general who thought he could beat the Germans. He was an administrator who had stopped thinking about whether there was anyone left to beat. And the tribes noticed. Into that gap stepped a man perfectly designed to exploit it. Arminius was a Cheruscan noble, the son of a chieftain. He had served in the Roman auxiliary forces, the non-citizen troops who fought alongside the legions, and he had served well enough to be granted Roman citizenship and elevated to equestrian rank, the second tier of the Roman aristocracy. He spoke Latin. He understood Roman tactics from the inside because he had used them. He knew how a legion marched, how it camped, how long it took to form up, and exactly how much of that machinery depended on open ground. And to Varus, he was the ideal local ally, a Germanic aristocrat who was also a Roman knight. Arminius attended his councils. Arminius dined with him. Arminius told him which tribes were restless and where the trouble was. Every piece of that was a lie, and Varus was told so. There was a second Cheruscan noble, a man named Segestes, who was a genuine Roman loyalist and who also had a personal reason to hate Arminius because Arminius had taken his daughter Thusnelda as a wife against his wishes. Segestes went to Varus and told him plainly that Arminius was organizing a conspiracy among the tribes, that the whole thing was a plan to trap the Roman army, and that Varus should arrest Arminius and the other chiefs in chains at once at the next assembly. He did not hint. He named the plot. Picture the room, a Roman governor's table somewhere east of the Rhine in the last weeks before the column marched. Varus is hosting. Around him are the Germanic nobles he governs through, the men whose loyalty is the entire basis of the arrangement. Arminius is among them, and Segestes stands up and tells Varus, in front of all of them, that these men are conspiring against him and that he should put them in chains tonight. Then he adds the detail that should have made Varus listen. He tells Varus to arrest him too. "Bind me as well," he says. "Arrest all of us, me, Arminius, every chief at this table, and then work out afterwards who was guilty and who was not." He offers to go into irons himself, alongside the men he is accusing, because he would rather be wrongly imprisoned than watch what he knows is coming. That is not the behavior of a man settling a family score. A man pursuing a private grudge asks you to arrest his enemy. He does not ask you to arrest him. Varus did nothing. And his reasoning was not stupid, which is what makes it worth sitting with. He knew about the feud over the Snelda. He looked at a man accusing his own son-in-law of treason, and he saw exactly what it looked like. A family quarrel dressed up as an intelligence report. He weighed the word of a Germanic noble with an obvious grudge against the word of a Roman citizen and equestrian who had served the empire in the field. He believed the evidence in front of him. He simply believed the wrong piece of it. That is the trap, not the forest, not the terrain. The trap was that Varus had a warning, in specific terms naming the right man and the right plan, and he had a completely reasonable framework in which to dismiss it. If you're learning something from this breakdown, take a second and hit subscribe. We cover battles like this every week, and you won't want to miss the next one. Because what happens next is not really a battle. It is 4 days of an army being taken apart while it tries to walk. Here is the situation as the column steps off. Varus is moving his forces from their summer position back towards their winter base on the Rhine, a routine seasonal march done every year. Then word arrives of a rising among a distant tribe. It is a small problem, the kind of thing the governor deals with on the way past. The report is false. Arminius planted it. So Varus turns his column off the established route and marches into unfamiliar country to deal with a rebellion that does not exist, and he does it with everything still attached. 6 cohorts of auxiliary infantry, 3 squadrons of cavalry, and behind them the full baggage train. Carts, pack mules, servants, wives, children, the whole apparatus a Roman army carried when it was not expecting to fight. He is not marching to a battle, he is marching to an administrative errand, and he is bringing the household with him. And he does it on the advice of Arminius, who then asks permission to ride ahead and raise local auxiliary forces to help. Varus gives it. Arminius rides away and does not come back. The country the Romans marched into was the worst possible ground for them. The Roman army was built to fight in formation. Heavy infantry in disciplined blocks, shields locked, on open, level terrain where the machine could operate. What they now had was narrow tracks winding between wooded hills and wet, boggy ground. At Kalkriese, the site most closely associated with the battle, the corridor between the hill and the great bog narrows to around 220 meters, a hillside rising on one flank, swamp on the other, and no room to deploy. A marching column in that terrain does not have a front and a back. It has miles of sides. Then the weather turned. The ancient accounts describe heavy rain and wind, trees coming down, the track dissolving into mud. Shields soaked through and grew heavy. Bowstrings and leather went slack. The wagons bombed. The attacks began as harassment. Javelins and spears out of the trees into the flank of the column, then nothing. No line to charge, no enemy to fix, no formation to break, because the enemy was not offering one. Small groups struck the column and withdrew into cover before the Romans could organize a response. On the second day they made the decision every commander dreads. They burned most of the wagons, abandoned the baggage that had slowed them to a crawl, and tried to march out light and in better order. It bought them nothing, because the problem was never their discipline. It was the ground, and the ground had been chosen for them. The attacks grew heavier as the days went on and more warriors joined. Archaeology at Kalkriese in modern Lower Saxony. The site identified from 1987 onwards after a British Army officer named Tony Clun began finding Roman coins and sling bullets with a metal detector, has revealed something remarkable. Running along the base of the hill, At the narrowest point of the corridor are the remains of a turf wall, at least 700 meters of it, about 1.5 meters high, reinforced with limestone in places. What is not in doubt is the pattern of the finds. They are spread along a corridor rather than concentrated where a single pitched battle would leave them. They describe exactly what the written sources describe: a running fight over days along a route. By the 4th day, the column was disintegrating. Valerius, one of Varus's own legates, took the cavalry and rode for the Rhine, leaving the infantry uncovered. Valerius Paterculus, who was writing within a generation of the battle, notes the end of it with some satisfaction. He did not outlive the men he abandoned. He was killed in the act of deserting them. Varus had been wounded. Understanding what was coming, and knowing what Rome did to commanders taken alive by the enemy and what the enemy did to prisoners, he took his own sword and killed himself. Several of his senior officers did the same. The remaining formations were surrounded and destroyed. Some men were killed where they stood. Others were taken and, according to the Roman accounts, sacrificed in sacred groves or kept for years as slaves. 6 years later, in the year 15, a Roman army under Germanicus marched back and found the place. Tacitus describes what they walked into, and it is one of the bleakest passages in Roman literature. Bones lying scattered where men had run, and in heaps where they had stood and fought together. Broken weapons and horse limbs in the open. Human skulls fastened to tree trunks. In the groves nearby, the altars where the tribunes and senior centurions had been killed. The army buried what it could find. No one could tell whose bones were whose, so they buried strangers and comrades together in a single mound, and Germanicus laid the first turf on it himself. We know one of the dead by name. A memorial stone raised near the Rhine and dug up again in 1620 commemorates Marcus Callias, son of Titus from Bologna, first centurion of the 18th Legion, aged 53 and a half. He fell in the words carved on it in the Varian War. The stone adds one line that tells you everything about what was left of that army. His bones may be interred here. It is a grave built empty in case anything was ever found. Nothing was. The news reached Rome and broke Augustus. Suetonius records that the emperor let his hair and beard grow for months, and that he would beat his head against a door, shouting, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." He was in his 70s. He had spent his life assembling something that was supposed to be permanent, and 3 of its legions had just vanished into a forest. But the strategic decision had already been made, and it was never seriously reversed. The frontier stopped at the Rhine. The province that existed on the maps in the year 9 was quietly deleted. Everything east of that river stayed outside the empire, permanently, and the line drawn by 4 days of fighting in a wet forest ended up shaping which half of Europe was Romanized and which half was not for the next 2,000 years. Arminius did not enjoy it for long. Having united the tribes against Rome, he could not keep them united without it. He was killed around the year 21, not by Romans, but by members of his own family and his own people, who suspected he was trying to make himself a king. And Varus? Varus is remembered as the man who lost 3 legions. But he did not lose them by being reckless or cowardly or stupid. He lost them by being certain that the war was finished, certain that the man sitting at his table was who he said he was. He had the intelligence. It was specific, and it was correct, and he had a perfectly sensible reason to throw it away. So, what should we cover next? Another army that walked into ground its enemy had chosen, carrying a warning it had already decided not to believe. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We're covering a new battle every week, where confidence turned out to be the trap.